It all started with the kind of chaos you only see in bad sitcoms or HOA meetings gone horribly wrong. Ethan Thompson, a 17-year-old with a knack for finding trouble without even trying, was in his driveway, casually shooting hoops. The day was quiet, eerily quiet, like the calm before a storm. But little did Ethan know, that storm wasn't going to come from the weather. Nope, it was barreling down the street in the form of a black SUV with tinted windows and no plates, screeching to a halt in front of his house like it was auditioning for a Fast and Furious sequel. Before Ethan could process what was happening, 3 men jumped out of the SUV. And I say men loosely because they looked less like professionals and more like 3 dads who'd gotten lost on their way to a Home Depot parking lot protest. They were wearing neon yellow vests with HOA compliance enforcement printed on them in bold letters, which would have been intimidating if not for the fact that one of them was holding a clipboard like it was a badge of honor. "You there," clipboard guy barked, pointing at Ethan with the kind of authority usually reserved for substitute teachers trying to control a rowdy classroom. "You're in violation of HOA regulations." Ethan stopped mid-dribble, staring at them like they just accused him of stealing the moon. What? Don't play dumb," tape measure guy chimed in, pulling out an actual tape measure, as if he were about to start measuring Ethan's driveway for some nefarious purpose. "You're using recreational equipment outside of designated hours. That's a clear breach of Section 14B of the HOA bylaws." Ethan blinked. "Recreational equipment? You mean my basketball hoop? It's literally attached to my house." "Rules are rules," added moral support guy, who up until this point had been standing silently but clearly felt it was his moment to shine. "Now, let's pause here for a second because this is where things go from mildly annoying to absolutely absurd. Pinewood Estates is one of those cookie-cutter suburban neighborhoods where the biggest drama usually involves someone's dog pooping on someone else's lawn. The idea that 3 grown men were confronting a teenager over an alleged basketball-related noise violation was so ridiculous it felt like performance art. Ethan tried to reason with them. "Look, I'm just playing basketball. It's not even that loud." Clipboard guy wasn't having it. "Doesn't matter. We've had complaints about noise levels coming from this property." Ethan glanced around at the empty street. The only noise louder than his basketball was Mrs. Jenkins' sprinkler system 2 houses down. Complaints? From who? The squirrels? "Enough," clipboard guy snapped. "Gentlemen, remove him from the premises." "Wait, what? Remove me? From my own house?" Ethan's voice cracked as he tried to process what he just heard, but before he could argue further, tape measure guy and moral support guy grabbed him by the arms and started dragging him toward their SUV, like he was some sort of hardened criminal caught smuggling illegal basketballs across state lines. At this point, Ethan's mom burst out of the house, phone in hand and fury in her eyes. "What is going on here?" Clipboard guy turned to her with all the smugness of someone who just memorized half a legal document and thought they were now qualified to practice law. "Ma'am," he began condescendingly, "your son is in violation of HOA regulations and must be removed from the property until further notice." "Removed? From his own home?" she repeated incredulously. "Yes," tape measure guy chimed in again, clearly enjoying his role as backup enforcer. She stared at them for a moment before bursting into laughter. A full-on belly laugh that made clipboard guy visibly uncomfortable. "You're joking, right? Please tell me this is some kind of weird prank." "We're dead serious," clipboard guy replied, puffing out his chest as if that would make him look more authoritative. "Oh, I'm sure you are," she said between chuckles. Then she turned to Ethan and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Call your father." And that's when things really started to spiral out of control. You see, Ethan's dad wasn't just any dad. He was David Thompson, Pinewood Estates police chief and a man who had zero tolerance for nonsense. And if there's one thing David hated more than nonsense, it was self-appointed HOA vigilantes pretending they had actual authority. While Ethan's mom dialed her husband faster than you can say bad idea, clipboard guy tried to regain control of the situation by pulling out what appeared to be an official-looking document from his clipboard. A notice of violation addressed to their family. "You'll also be fined $500 for this infraction," he declared smugly. "For playing basketball?" Ethan asked incredulously. For disturbing the peace, clipboard guy corrected him. Ethan couldn't help but laugh at that one. Disturbing the peace? In Pinewood Estates? The only thing disturbing about this neighborhood was Karen, the HOA president, who once tried to fine someone for parking their car too close to their mailbox. Speaking of Karen, it didn't take long for her to show up once she heard about the commotion. Because let's face it, Karen always knows when there's commotion. She arrived wearing her usual power suit and heels combo that screamed, "I'm important," even though everyone secretly rolled their eyes whenever she walked into a room. "What seems to be the issue here?" she asked clipboard guy as if she hadn't orchestrated this entire fiasco herself. "We've apprehended this young man for violating Section 14B, he explained dutifully. Karen nodded approvingly before turning her attention to Ethan's mom with an expression that could curdle milk. But before she could say anything condescending or ridiculous, David pulled up in his squad car, and let me tell you, he did not look happy. And oh boy, things were about to get interesting. David Thompson stepped out of his squad car with the kind of presence that could silence a room full of rowdy middle schoolers. He wasn't a particularly tall man, but he didn't need to be. The way he carried himself, the sharp uniform, the piercing gaze, the aura of "I don't have time for your nonsense," was enough to make even the boldest HOA enforcer think twice. Unfortunately for Clipboard Guy and his merry band of compliance warriors, they weren't exactly known for their critical thinking skills. "Can someone explain to me why my son is being manhandled in his own driveway?" David asked, his voice calm but with just enough edge to make everyone's stomach drop. Clipboard Guy, clearly unaware that he was standing in front of a man who had probably arrested people for crimes far more serious than playing basketball, puffed out his chest and stepped forward. "Sir, your son has violated HOA regulations by using recreational equipment outside of approved hours. We are simply enforcing the rules." David raised an eyebrow. "Enforcing the rules? You mean dragging a teenager off his own property like you're auditioning for cops?" "It's all outlined in the bylaws," Clipboard Guy insisted, holding up a document like it was the Constitution itself. "Section 14B clearly states that." David held up a hand to cut him off. "Let me stop you right there. First of all, I've read those bylaws cover to cover, don't ask why, and nowhere does it say you can physically remove someone from their own property. Second, even if it did, you're not law enforcement. You're not even security guards. You're three guys in vests pretending to have authority." Karen chose this moment to step in because, of course, she did. "Chief Thompson," she began in her signature condescending tone, the one she probably practiced in front of a mirror every morning. "We appreciate your service to the community, but as president of the HOA, I must insist that we handle this matter internally." David turned to her with a look that could have frozen lava. "Internally? Karen, your internal process just involved 3 grown men putting their hands on my kid and threatening him with a $500 fine for playing basketball." Karen bristled but didn't back down. "We have protocols in place for situations like this." "Protocols?" David repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Karen, this isn't a nuclear power plant. It's a neighborhood where people argue about whose lawn gnome is tackier." Ethan, still standing off to the side with his mom, couldn't help but smirk at that one. His mom nudged him and whispered, "Your dad's on fire today." Karen wasn't done yet, though. She straightened her blazer and said, "The HOA exists to maintain order and uphold community standards." David crossed his arms. "Community standards? Karen, last month you tried to fine the Johnsons because their Christmas lights were still up in January." "It's called seasonal decor abuse," Karen shot back defensively. David blinked at her like she'd just spoken in tongues. "Seasonal decor abuse?" "Yes," Karen said firmly, "and it's outlined in Section 22F. At this point, Ethan couldn't hold back anymore and burst out laughing. Clipboard Guy shot him a glare but wisely decided not to say anything. David took a deep breath and pinched the bridge of his nose like he was trying to ward off an impending headache. Then he turned back to Clipboard Guy and said, "Let me see that bylaw you keep waving around." Clipboard Guy hesitated but eventually handed over the document. David scanned it quickly before letting out a low chuckle that made everyone, even Karen, look nervous. "This," he said, holding up the paper like it was evidence in court, "isn't even an official HOA document. It's a printout from some random website about generic HOA guidelines." Clipboard Guy's face turned bright red as he stammered, "WL, it's based on similar principles." "Similar principles?" David interrupted, his voice rising slightly for the first time. "You're out here harassing people based on similar principles? Do you even know what jurisdiction means?" Clipboard Guy opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "That's what I thought," David said sharply before turning back to Karen. "And you let these clowns run around pretending they have legal authority?" Karen looked flustered for the first time all day but quickly recovered. "They're volunteers. We don't have the budget for professional enforcement officers." "Volunteers," David repeated incredulously. He gestured toward Tape Measure Guy and Moral Support Guy, who were both doing their best impressions of statues at this point. These two looked like they got lost on their way to a tailgate party. Tape Measure Guy muttered something under his breath about how he actually liked tailgating but wisely kept it quiet. By now, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk because nothing draws suburbanites faster than drama involving the HOA. Mrs. Jenkins from 2 houses down leaned over to whisper loudly to Mr. Patel next door, "I told you Karen was going too far this time." Karen noticed the growing audience and tried one last desperate move to save face. She turned to David and said, "Chief Thompson, I think we can all agree that this situation has gotten out of hand." "Oh, we're way past out of hand," David replied coolly. "But," Karen continued as if he hadn't spoken, "perhaps we can resolve this amicably without involving outside authorities." David gave her a long look before saying slowly, "Karen, I am outside authorities." The crowd erupted into muffled laughter while Karen's face turned an interesting shade of crimson. At this point, Ethan decided to chime in because why not? He gestured toward Clipboard Guy and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "So do I get my $500 back or what?" The laughter grew louder as Clipboard Guy looked like he wanted to disappear into thin air. David held up a hand again to quiet everyone down before addressing Karen one last time. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to call an emergency HOA meeting tonight, open invitation, and explain why your so-called enforcement team is running around violating people's rights based on fake documents." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but David cut her off with a glare that could have melted steel. "And," he added pointedly, "if I hear so much as one more complaint about you or your team pulling stunts like this again, well." He let the sentence hang ominously before turning back toward Ethan and his mom. "Come on," he said briskly as he started walking toward the house. "Let's go inside before I lose any more brain cells talking about seasonal decor abuse." As they walked away amidst scattered applause from their neighbors, Ethan couldn't help but grin at his dad and say, "That was awesome." David smirked but didn't respond because deep down he knew this wasn't over yet. But for now, victory tasted pretty sweet. David Thompson wasn't the kind of man to let things slide. Sure, he could have walked away after the driveway showdown, chalked it up to Karen being Karen and her HOA henchmen being, well, idiots. But no, this wasn't just about Ethan getting dragged off his own property like some kind of suburban outlaw. This was about principle. And if there was one thing David couldn't stand, it was people abusing their so-called authority to make everyone else miserable. So later that evening, David sat at his dining room table with a stack of papers, his laptop open, and a cup of coffee that was more caffeine than liquid. Ethan and his mom watched from the kitchen as he pored over every document he could find about Pinewood Estates' HOA bylaws, local ordinances, and, because why not, state laws on impersonating law enforcement. "What's he doing?" Ethan whispered to his mom. "Building a case," she replied with a smirk. "You know how your dad gets when someone pokes the bear." And oh, had Karen poked the bear. By the time the emergency HOA meeting rolled around that night, word had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The community center was packed, standing room only, with residents who were equal parts curious and fed up. Karen sat at the front of the room, flanked by Clipboard Guy, Tape Measure Guy, and Moral Support Guy, who all looked significantly less confident than they had earlier in the day. Clipboard Guy kept fidgeting with his clipboard like it was some kind of security blanket. David walked in with Ethan and his mom right behind him. He wasn't wearing his uniform. This wasn't official police business. But he carried himself with the same no-nonsense air that made everyone instinctively sit up straighter when he entered the room. He took a seat near the front but didn't say anything right away. He just waited. Karen cleared her throat and stood up, trying to project authority despite the fact that half the room was glaring at her. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began in her best, "I'm totally in control" voice. "As you know, we've had an incident today involving a violation of HOA regulations." "Violation?" someone interrupted from the back of the room. "You mean when your goons kidnapped a kid for playing basketball?" The room erupted into murmurs and laughter as Karen's face turned bright red. "That's not what happened," she snapped. "We were enforcing community standards." "Community standards?" another voice called out. "Since when does that include assault?" Karen opened her mouth to respond but was cut off by David standing up. The room went silent almost instantly. "Karen," he said calmly but firmly, "why don't you explain exactly what happened today? And while you're at it, maybe you can show us where in the bylaws it says your team has the authority to physically remove someone from their own property." Karen hesitated for a moment before gesturing to clipboard guy. "Mr. Jenkins," she said, addressing him by name for what was probably the first time ever, "please present the documentation." Clipboard guy stood up nervously and shuffled through his papers before holding one up like it was Exhibit A in a courtroom drama. Section 14B clearly states that recreational equipment must not be used outside designated hours, he said quickly. "And where does it say you can drag someone off their property?" David asked. Clipboard guy froze like a deer in headlights. "Well, it doesn't specifically say that. So you just made it up?" David pressed. "No, I mean, we were acting in the best interest of the community," Clipboard guy stammered. David raised an eyebrow. "The best interest of the community? By traumatizing a teenager over a basketball hoop." The murmurs grew louder as more neighbors chimed in with their own grievances against Karen and her crew. Someone mentioned getting fined for having their trash cans out 5 minutes too early on garbage day. Another person complained about being threatened with legal action because their mailbox wasn't painted the exact shade of beige specified in the HOA handbook. It quickly became clear that this wasn't just about Ethan's basketball hoop. It was about years of petty power trips and ridiculous rules that had pushed everyone to their breaking point. Karen tried to regain control of the meeting by banging her gavel on the table. Yes, she actually had a gavel, but it only made things worse. "Enough!" she shouted over the noise. "This is not up for debate. The HOA exists to maintain order and ensure property values remain high." David crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair. "Funny you should mention property values," he said casually. Karen froze mid-rant and turned to him warily. "What do you mean?" "Well," David said with a small smile, "I did some digging this afternoon. Public records are fascinating, by the way, and I found something interesting." He pulled out a folder from his bag and held it up for everyone to see. "Did you know that over the past 3 years, Pinewood Estates has issued more fines per household than any other neighborhood in this county? And yet our property values have actually gone down during that time." The room erupted into gasps and whispers as Karen's face went pale. "But wait," David continued, clearly enjoying himself now. "It gets better. Turns out most of those fines weren't even legitimate according to state law because they weren't properly documented or approved by a majority vote from HOA members." Karen tried to interrupt, but David held up a hand to stop her. "And then there's this little gem," he added, pulling out another piece of paper. "A copy of a contract between the HOA and a so-called enforcement agency." He glanced at Clipboard Guy and smirked before looking back at Karen. "Care to explain why our HOA dues are being used to pay these guys $200 an hour to harass residents?" The room exploded into chaos as neighbors started yelling questions at Karen, while Clipboard Guy looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Karen tried desperately to regain control, but it was too late. The tide had turned against her completely. By the end of the night, several residents had called for an immediate vote to remove Karen as HOA president and dissolve her so-called enforcement team altogether. It wasn't official yet, It would take more meetings and paperwork, but it was clear that Karen's reign of terror was coming to an end. As David walked out of the community center with Ethan and his mom by his side, several neighbors stopped him to shake his hand or pat him on the back. "You're a hero," one woman said sincerely. David shrugged modestly but couldn't hide his grin as he replied, "Nah, I just hate bullies." The fallout from the HOA meeting was swift and glorious. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of Pinewood Estates, was officially dethroned, or at least as close to dethroned as one can get in suburban politics. The residents had spoken, and they were done with her nonsense. But David wasn't finished yet. Oh no, Karen had messed with his family, and he wasn't about to let her slink away without answering for her crimes, or, at the very least, her questionable decision-making. The next morning, David sat at his desk at the police station, sipping his coffee and reviewing the stack of documents he'd brought home from the HOA meeting. He'd already flagged several red flags, contracts that didn't make sense, fines that seemed arbitrary, and a suspicious lack of transparency in how HOA funds were being spent. But one document stood out above the rest: the contract between Karen's HOA and the so-called enforcement agency she'd hired. Now, let's be clear. Calling these guys an enforcement agency was like calling a lemonade stand a Fortune 500 company. The contract was riddled with vague language, absurd hourly rates, and absolutely no accountability. It didn't take a legal expert to see that Karen had been using HOA funds to pay these guys to act as her personal army, and she'd been doing it for years. David leaned back in his chair and smirked. This was going to be fun. By noon, David had assembled a small team of officers to help him investigate further. They started by tracking down the so-called enforcement agency, which turned out to be nothing more than a shady LLC registered to a P.O. box in another state. The owner? None other than Clipboard Guy himself, whose real name, as it turned out, was Todd Jenkins. Todd Jenkins wasn't exactly a criminal mastermind. In fact, he wasn't much of anything. His LinkedIn profile listed him as a freelance compliance consultant, which sounded impressive until you realized it was just a fancy way of saying he made up rules and charged people for enforcing them. His business model was simple: find HOAs with power-hungry presidents like Karen, offer them professional enforcement services, and rake in the cash while pretending to know what he was doing. David couldn't help but laugh when he read Todd's online reviews. One particularly scathing review described him as a glorified hall monitor who thinks he's Judge Judy. Another simply said, "Avoid at all costs." With Todd's shady business exposed, David turned his attention back to Karen. He knew she wouldn't go down without a fight. She was too stubborn for that, but he also knew she wasn't nearly as clever as she thought she was. It didn't take long for him to uncover more incriminating evidence: inflated budgets, unapproved expenditures, and even a few instances where Karen had used HOA funds to pay for personal expenses. One receipt stood out in particular: $1,200 for executive office supplies. The itemized list included a designer desk chair, a custom nameplate that read "Madam President," and, wait for it, a gavel engraved with her initials. David shook his head in disbelief. "She bought herself a gavel," he muttered to himself. Of course she did. By the end of the day, David had compiled enough evidence to make even the most lenient judge raise an eyebrow. He handed off the documents to the district attorney's office with a recommendation to investigate Karen for fraud and misuse of funds. Meanwhile, back in Pinewood Estates, word of Karen's downfall spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had once lived in fear of her petty fines and passive-aggressive emails were now openly celebrating her demise. Someone even started a group chat called Karen Free Zone, where residents shared memes mocking her reign of terror. Ethan couldn't resist joining in on the fun. He created a meme featuring Karen holding her engraved gavel with the caption, "When you think you're Judge Judy, but you're really just Judy from accounting." It went viral within hours. Karen, predictably, didn't take kindly to her newfound infamy. She tried desperately to rally support among her remaining allies, which mostly consisted of Todd Jenkins and his two sidekicks, but it was too late. The residents had already voted to dissolve her enforcement team and audit the HOA's finances. And then came the cherry on top. Todd Jenkins was arrested for impersonating law enforcement after several residents filed complaints against him. Apparently, this wasn't his first rodeo. He'd pulled similar stunts in other neighborhoods before landing in Pinewood Estates. When David heard about Todd's arrest, he couldn't help but smile. Justice might not always be swift, but it sure was satisfying. As for Karen, she resigned as HOA president under pressure from the residents and quietly moved out of Pinewood Estates a few weeks later. Rumor has it she tried to start over in another neighborhood, but let's be honest. Once you've been publicly humiliated as Madam President, it's hard to bounce back. With Karen gone and Todd behind bars, well, technically just county jail, Pinewood Estates finally returned to normal, or at least as normal as suburban life gets. The residents held a barbecue to celebrate their newfound freedom from ridiculous rules and fines. Ethan even got an apology from several neighbors who admitted they'd been too afraid to stand up to Karen before now. David attended the barbecue too. Not because he wanted recognition, but because he genuinely cared about his community. As he stood by the grill flipping burgers, one neighbor approached him with a smile. "Chief Thompson," she said warmly, "I think I speak for everyone when I say thank you." David shrugged modestly but couldn't hide his grin as he replied, "Hey, I'm just glad we can all play basketball without getting arrested." The neighbor laughed before handing him a plate of food. "You've earned this." And just like that, life in Pinewood Estates went back to being what it should have been all along. Peaceful, friendly, and most importantly, Karen-free. With Karen gone and Todd Jenkins enjoying his new accommodations in county jail, Pinewood Estates had finally returned to a state of calm. The oppressive reign of the HOA was over, and the residents were basking in their newfound freedom. Lawn flamingos popped up like wildflowers, basketball hoops stayed up 24/7, and someone even painted their mailbox bright purple just because they could. It was suburban anarchy, and it was glorious. Ethan, of course, was thriving in this new era of HOA-free living. He'd become something of a local celebrity after the whole basketball hoop kidnapping debacle. Neighbors would stop him on the street to thank him for standing up to Karen and her goons. One elderly woman even baked him a pie, which Ethan happily accepted because, well, who says no to pie? David, on the other hand, was just happy to have his weekends back. No more late-night calls about illegal garden gnomes or unauthorized holiday decorations. He could finally enjoy a quiet Saturday morning with his coffee and newspaper without having to deal with Karen's nonsense. Life was good, but as anyone who's ever lived in a neighborhood knows, peace in suburbia is always temporary. It started innocently enough, too innocently in hindsight. One sunny afternoon, about 2 weeks after Karen's resignation, there was a knock at the Thompsons' front door. Ethan opened it to find a man standing there with a clipboard, because of course he had a clipboard. He was middle-aged, wearing khakis and a polo shirt that screamed, "I just came from a golf course." And he had the kind of smile that made you instinctively check your wallet. "Hi there," the man said cheerfully. "I'm Ted. I'm the new interim president of the HOA. Ethan blinked at him. "The HOA? I thought we got rid of that." Ted chuckled like Ethan had just told a cute joke. "Oh no, he said. "You can't just get rid of an HOA. It's part of the community charter. But don't worry. I'm here to make things better." Ethan stared at him for a moment before calling over his shoulder, "Dad, there's another one." David appeared at the door moments later, his expression shifting from curiosity to exasperation as soon as he saw Ted's clipboard. "What do you want?" he asked bluntly. Ted didn't seem fazed by David's less-than-warm welcome. "I'm just introducing myself to all the residents," he said brightly. "As I was telling your son here, I'm the new interim president of the HOA." "Interim?" David repeated skeptically. "Yes," Ted said with a nod. "Just until we can hold official elections." David crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe. "And who appointed you interim president?" "Well," Ted began hesitantly, "technically, I did." David raised an eyebrow. "You appointed yourself?" Ted cleared his throat awkwardly. "It's all perfectly legal under Section 3C of the Community Charter." "Let me guess," David said dryly. "You're here to enforce community standards." Ted's face lit up like David had just handed him a gold star. Exactly. I knew you'd understand. David sighed deeply and pinched the bridge of his nose. He could already feel the headache forming. Ted took this as his cue to launch into what could only be described as a TED Talk, pun absolutely intended, about his vision for Pinewood Estates. He talked about maintaining property values, fostering community spirit, and, most importantly, ensuring that everyone followed the rules. You see, Ted said earnestly, rules are what keep us civilized. Without them, we'd have chaos, anarchy, purple mailboxes. David glanced over at Ethan and muttered under his breath, "This guy's worse than Karen." Ethan nodded solemnly. At least Karen didn't have this much energy. By the time Ted finally left, after handing David a stack of pamphlets titled, "Why HOAs Are Your Best Friend," the Thompsons were already plotting their next move. "We can't let this guy take over," Ethan said as soon as Ted was out of earshot. David nodded in agreement. "If we don't stop him now, we'll be back to getting fined for breathing too loudly by next week." And so began Operation Dethrone Ted. The first step was simple: gather intel. David spent hours combing through public records and online forums for anything he could find about Ted. It didn't take long to uncover some interesting tidbits, like how Ted had been kicked out of 2 previous HOAs for being overzealous, which is suburban code for insufferable. Meanwhile, Ethan took to social media to rally support from their neighbors. He posted memes featuring Ted holding his clipboard with captions like, "Asterisk, when you think you're saving the neighborhood but everyone hates you." Asterisk, the posts went viral within hours. But the real turning point came when one neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, revealed that she'd overheard Ted bragging about how much money he planned to make from HOA fines once he was officially elected president. "That's it," David said when he heard this. "We're taking him down." The next HOA meeting was packed, standing room only again. But this time it wasn't because people were afraid of getting fined for skipping it. No, they were here for one reason: to watch David Thompson roast Ted into oblivion. And roast him he did. David started by calmly presenting all the evidence he'd gathered about Ted's shady past, including testimonies from residents in his previous neighborhoods who described him as everything from a nightmare to the reason we moved. Then he moved on to Ted's self-appointment as interim president, pointing out how it violated multiple sections of the community charter. By the time David finished speaking, Ted looked like he wanted to crawl under his clipboard and disappear. The residents voted unanimously to remove Ted from his self-appointed position and disband the HOA entirely, for real this time. As they filed out of the meeting room, several neighbors stopped to thank David for standing up for them once again. "You've saved us twice now," one man said gratefully. David shrugged modestly but couldn't hide his grin as he replied, "Just doing my civic duty." And so Pinewood Estates finally found peace. Not temporary peace this time, but real peace. The kind where people could paint their mailboxes any color they wanted without fear of retribution. As for Ted, well, rumor has it he tried starting an HOA in another neighborhood but got shut down after 2 weeks when someone called him out for being insufferable. And with that, our story comes to an end, or does it? Because let's be honest, in suburbia, there's always another clipboard lurking around the corner. If you enjoyed this story, and let's face it, who doesn't love watching petty tyrants get what they deserve? Make sure to like this video, share it with your friends who've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare, we all know someone, and leave a comment below about your own HOA horror stories. And don't forget to subscribe for more tales of suburban drama and sweet revenge. Thanks for watching.